Yeah, thank you, Andre. And just before we do that, I'm just going to run a second poll, and then just to ask all of you in the audience again a question and make you participate. And so hopefully you'll join us in this poll. And this is to find out from you where you currently deploy and manage your databases, which will be interesting to look at also when Art does the demo in ClusterControl and also the presentation further on by Andre. So whether you deploy on-premise or in the public cloud or in the private cloud, or maybe it's a combination, like a hybrid solution that you're using, it'd be really interesting to see and to get your feedback here. And similar to the first poll, I'll share the results, of course, once everyone had a chance to participate. So I'll just give it a few more seconds. Thanks for your participation here. And while you still place your votes, just a reminder that you can ask us questions at any moment by using the question section of your control panel. And we'll answer them as we go along, and certainly towards the end of the webinar, we'll have a few minutes to answer questions there. So feel free to ask them at any point if you have questions on the content that you're hearing and seeing about today. So thank you for your participation. I'm just going to close this now and share the results. Great. So it looks like the majority of you are deploying and managing a database on premise, which is something that that we also tend to see. People tend to go for that solution. It kind of depends, of course, on what the database is used for, and then private cloud seems to be the next option. Andre or Art, any comments on this before we continue?
Personally, I would be interested whether the private cloud is a hosted cloud by, let's say, a third-party cloud environment, or if it's like on-premise private cloud. So you install, for instance, OpenStack on your own servers. So that would be interesting for me, I guess.
Yeah, so maybe we can get some feedback on that from everyone who's participating. If you like, you can give us your feedback here also in the question section of your control panel. But thank you for now for participating, and I'll hand over to you now, Art.
Okay, thank you. Just a minute. There we go. Okay, I think we're good. JJ, can you see the login?
Yeah,
screen?
Perfect.
Yeah, good. Okay, so what I'm going to demo here today is the ClusterControl interface. So basically, this is the login interface. And I've heard a couple of clusters that we have in this presentation, like the Galera cluster, the Mongo shard cluster, but also traditional master-slave replication. And the idea was to go quickly through ClusterControl and show you what you can do within the ClusterControl interface. So everything within ClusterControl is built around the idea of deployment, maintenance, monitoring, and scaling. And those are the 4 pillars. And especially if you would look over here, there are 3 big buttons that allow you to deploy instantly either a new database cluster or a single database node. It's like this. And you can already build, for instance, your Galera cluster, selecting the vendor of choice. In our case, maybe you want to run MariaDB. You can select the version MariaDB you want to deploy and the number of nodes. And that's very important because you want to immediately kick off your Galera cluster with the right amount of nodes instead of later on adding nodes each time. So within this interface, we can very quickly add nodes here, and for instance, I'm just adding a couple of them, and you just fill them in, all of them, and you press the deploy button, and within 10-15 minutes, you will have a working Galera cluster, and everything is done by ClusterControl in the background. So the user interface allows you to define your cluster, your cluster topology, your cluster type, and in the background a job will be run that just creates a first Galera node and then adds simultaneously new nodes to the cluster. So if you select, for instance, 7 nodes in your cluster, it will just iterate over these new nodes. The same goes for master-slave replication. You add one database node to create the cluster, and then later on you can add new nodes to it. If we go into Galera cluster, in the overview, the standard overview will give you the most important information of your cluster. So we can see that down here, the number of nodes in our cluster, they're up, they're running, they're synced, they're not behind in replication. So that's most important information. We can select the CPU usage, we can look at the disk stats, or even network stats in case we really want to see whether we're network bound. And up here we have the most important metrics like the Galera flow control, which reflects how frequently your replication is pausing. And this is especially interesting as Galera is replicating everything synchronously. So at the same time you're committing your data to the cluster, it will just send it to the other nodes in the cluster and ask them for confirmation whether it can write the data. And if that process pauses for some reason, for instance, 2 transactions at the same time happen, and they affect the exact same row, they will be paused, and you will see that in the flow control. As long as this line is basically a flat line, everything is fine. So it's one of the most important metrics. And obviously, this overview is only available for the type Galera cluster. It doesn't make sense to add this to, for instance, a MySQL replicated cluster. Within our nodes overview, you can also perform all sorts of actions on your nodes. So, for instance, if we select one of the nodes, we can shut it down, we can reboot it, we can bootstrap a cluster. So, for instance, if I have a failed cluster and I have to build a cluster up again, because as Galera is a clustered environment, it needs to be aware which node is the source of all your data. So you can bootstrap it here, and if you select it, execute it, this particular node will be used as the source for the whole cluster, and all the data will be synced to the other nodes. You can enable binary logging, which is important if you want to add, for instance, read slaves. So you can run like a hybrid Galera cluster with MySQL replication underneath it. In this cluster example, I installed HAProxy also because Andrew runs HAProxy, so it would be nice to also show you that we have like the graphical user interface of HAProxy incorporated into ClusterControl. So you can either go to the node itself and look it up there, but you can also watch it immediately from ClusterControl. We also installed KeepAliveD, and KeepAliveD is making the 2 HAProxys highly available. So we add a virtual IP to one of the nodes. In this case, I think the .14 node has the virtual IP. Suppose the .14 node would be unavailable due to some reason, then automatically ClusterControl will runs the KeepAliveD in the background and will assign the virtual IP to the other HAProxy instance. Another interesting thing to mention here is like our advisors and health reports used to be what we used in the past for the advisors. The advisors are basically running in the background, giving you advice on your cluster. So we might think that, I don't know if there's anything here at the moment here. We got one host that is currently swapping for some reason. So it gives us a warning that it's swapping and we should change this and we should act accordingly. So this can really help you as to keep your cluster healthy. There are a couple of other things like performance schema is disabled, so we cannot run certain checks. We can enable this. It tells you exactly how to enable the performance schema in your cluster. So these are basically helpers for you to make your life easier. We can schedule backups, which is really important if you want to keep your data safely. Once a backup has been created, we also allow you to sync your backups to Glacier, so S3 in Amazon. And of course, then you don't have your backups on premises anymore, but suppose your whole data center goes haywire, you always have a copy in Glacier. And of course, here is also the ability in the backups. There are currently no backups made on this cluster. But normally you could select here backup and then restore the backup to the cluster of choice. Within the management, we have several choices, like the configuration management, so you don't have to go into the host themselves to change the MyCNF, for instance, and also for MaxScale, you can edit the configuration of MaxScale directly. And this is really an easy way to update your configurations. You can simply change a parameter on, for instance, all instances, or only a select number of hosts. Select the section, and then you have all the parameters you can change. So if we would change, for instance, where is it? I'm looking for the number of connections. I'll just do it this way. So it's not. For some reason it's not showing. There it is. There it is. Okay, so we can see that everything is configured. It's actually configured differently. The first server only has 200 connections at this moment. So what we can do, we can just sync them to become all equal, and it will just tell me that there's no database node restart required, and the other two are already configured for 500, so it's ignoring that. So we can easily change parameters here, and this is really friendly because you don't have to go to the host itself, change it in a MySQL there, or in runtime on the host. You can look at job logs, so you can see all the jobs that we have run in our cluster environment. It's like we added HAProxy, we added keep-alive-d, and all jobs here have finished properly, but if there was one that failed, you can just click on it and you can see the exact step where it exited with exit code 1, for instance, and then resolve the issue. You can also view your system logs here, and that's really handy because now you don't need to go again into the host themselves. You can just read your MySQL log here or the backup logs to see whether your backups have been created properly, or if there's an error, why there was an error. And that saves you from actually going into the host themselves.